Hi, Nancy. Everybody good this morning? I guess we're ready to go?
A little cold.
A little cold, all right. Well, good morning to all of you, and thank you for being here. And I hope you don't mind us bugging you again this morning on the subject of the emerald ash borer. Want to start out by welcoming Lynn Johnson here. You all know Lynn, I think, and you may be less acquainted with Eric Berg, but he's been a great partner of ours and comes from the Nebraska Forest Service. So thank you both for being here today and participating in this. As you all know, this invasive beetle, which is native to Asia, I believe, has already destroyed tens of millions of ash trees in the country since it was first discovered in Michigan in 2002. It has not been found in Lincoln yet, but experts tell us it's very likely already here and simply unidentified at the moment. The city has been working with Nebraska Forest Service on this issue for several years, as most of you know. We've been in and out of the legislature and into forums across the community, educating the public about the pendency of this disaster. And now, today, we are finally ready to release a draft of our plan to respond and to recover from the devastating tree loss that we will soon see in our community. All ash trees are susceptible to EAB. This is a slide you have possibly seen before. We've shown it to you. It shows what can and will happen to ash trees in just a 3-year period left to themselves. From the experience of other communities, we know that all untreated ash trees will be dead within a 15-year period from the time that EAB moves into the community. So the clock probably is already ticking. We also know from others' experiences that a proactive response to EAB is the best course of action to manage what we call the death curve and to avoid an overwhelming number of dead and dying ash trees along our streets and on other public property at any one point in time. Infested ash trees become very brittle. So if we are not proactive, we will see a very dangerous situation develop in the city that comes with potential city liability. Waiting to take action will also be much more costly to taxpayers. Lincoln has in the neighborhood of 14,000 public ash trees along the streets and in the parks and on the golf courses. The recommended approach is the managed removal and replacement of these trees over a 15-year period. By taking this action, we can reduce the impact of the death curve and best protect our community. Chemical treatment can prolong the life of some ash trees, and we plan to treat some public trees until they can be removed and replaced. During the past 2 years, the Parks and Recreation Department has been purchasing equipment and hiring and training staff to be able to accomplish the task of removing and replacing 1,000 public ash trees each year. Staff has removed 567 ash trees during 2017. I want to commend Lynn and his staff for working with the private sector to come up with the most cost-effective way of removing the public trees. Together, they have determined that the city staff will focus on the removal of trees less than 18 inches in diameter. We plan to contract with the private sector service companies to remove larger public ash trees. The department also plans to contract with private companies for chemical treatment of some public trees in the future and for replacing public trees. The Parks and Recreation staff are also working with neighborhood groups to plan ash tree removal and replanting. The approach is to begin with smaller ash trees and then move to the bigger trees. Residents who are interested in the planning process are encouraged to contact our community outreach forester, Lori Gruber. Did I pronounce that right? Oh, hi, Lori. How are you? Her contact information is hopefully on the screen. Yes, it is, and will be in your news release documents too. The draft EAB response and recovery plan also invites residents and businesses and organizations of other types to adopt public ash trees along the streets and in the parks by paying for chemical treatment. Those wishing to adopt public ash trees will be asked to get a no-cost permit from Parks and Recreation. The permit will need to be renewed every 2 years with the routine chemical treatment cycle. The permit system will allow us to track public trees that have been adopted. Right now, we are estimating that EAB response and recovery will cost about $22.8 million over the 15-year period of endeavor. But the cost of delaying or doing nothing is much higher. We will continue to look for ways we can work with the community and the private sector to keep the costs as low as possible. The next step, though, is to ask the community to review the draft plan and to share comments with us during the month, I think, of February entirely, right? Okay. So for the whole month of February, you're taking input. Yeah. All right. The draft plan is available online at parks.lincoln.ne.gov, and you will see a link on the main page of the website. Paper copies of the plan are also available at all Lincoln libraries and the Parks and Recreation Administration building at 31st and O Street. What's that address again? 3131 O Street. Yeah. Okay. They have a new address that they're very proud of.
As of today.
As of today. So that's news too. Comments on the plan can be submitted in writing through regular mail or through email. So please get your comments in by March 1st. This will allow staff time to make any decisions with respect to changes before the plan is reviewed by the Community Forestry Advisory Board, which meets then on March 13th. That open meeting begins at 4 p.m. at the Parks and Recreation office. The Community Forestry Advisory Board will then be asked to make a recommendation to the City Council on adoption of the plan. We expect the Council to consider adoption in early April. The Council also will be asked to amend city codes to establish the no-cost permit system for the chemical treatment of the public trees so that we can also move forward with the Adopt an Ash Tree program. Now, before I turn this over to Eric, I want to mention how this EAB plan advances the larger environmental action plan, or what we've identified to the community as the LEAP plan, which is the overall environmental plan adopted by the council in December of last year. One of the 14 key strategies for a sustainable future for Lincoln is the development and adoption of an EAB action plan. The LEAP was developed with a great deal of public input already, and we hope that the public will react in a similar positive way to our draft plan for the Emerald Ash Borer. In introducing Eric, I also would like to thank the Nebraska Forest Service for being present at the beginning of this process of reacting to this disaster, and for all the input and information and education you've given us and your willingness to stand beside us in addressing our part of the problem here in Lincoln. They deal with the whole state, of course. Their website is at eabne.info. Great resource for everybody that wants to know everything about the emerald ash borer. So with that, Eric,
Thanks, Mayor.
welcome.
Thank you very much. I have a few brief prepared comments and will be available for any questions following this. The Nebraska Forest Service is very supportive of this proposed plan, given it is very forward-looking. Has a multi-tier approach over multiple years. It will take a decade or more to manage this invasive pest. While many communities implement a management or response plan, the City of Lincoln has identified from step one that this recovery aspect is just as important part of the plan. Literally hundreds of communities across the country have faced and managed this pest at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. There is no one-size-that-fits-all response plans. Different management scenarios work differently in different communities. But Lincoln has assembled a plan based on the input from many resources, which contains all of the management elements which the Nebraska Forest Service fully supports and endorses. And this includes knowing your resource. The City of Lincoln has completed a GIS-based inventory of the community forest, engaging the community with news and information on emerald ash borer, proactive ash tree removal targeting the worst conditioned trees as well as smaller diameter trees, chemical treatment of the highest quality trees, and the ability of the general public to save their most favorite trees through the Adopt an Ash program. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, an active tree planting replacement program to continue to rebuild the lost tree canopy, which is so appreciated by the citizens of Lincoln. Lincoln Parks and Rec and Forestry Department, with the input from the Tree Board and many local partners, have not only agreed to replant trees, but to dramatically increase the diversity of the trees being planted so we can better combat future issues, such as climate change and future invasives. I would also encourage the general public to consider increasing the tree diversity on their own private property and follow the recommendations of right tree in terms of the right species, the right place, avoiding under utility lines, and the right planting way, proper depth. There are many great resources online, as the mayor said, and you can find a lot of those on Retree Nebraska, the Nebraska Forest Service, UNL Extension, and EAB. Thank you.
All right, we're saving Lynn from formal remarks so that he can answer all the questions. And with that, we'll invite the questions.
Can you say a little bit about the cost of the chemical treatment program so people will know what they're getting into? And also, they can't start now, right? You have to have identified that the borer is here.
Yeah, the recommendation is that chemical treatment not start until emerald ash borer is identified or been identified within 15 miles. And right now Lincoln is just beyond that 15-mile radius. The reason to not begin treatment right now is that essentially every time you inject that tree, you're causing some damage. And so it's better to wait at this point to begin treatment. The cost of treatment is really based on the tree diameter. So it varies depending on the tree size. On average, we're anticipating the cost is about $200 to $225 per application, and that will need to be done every 2 years or so. And that's for the trunk injection method. There are other methods. The least environmental impact is created through the trunk injection method, and it's probably the most effective method as well.
And do you have any rules about what trees people can or cannot adopt, or any suggestions on ones that should be adopted?
It's a great question. When somebody applies for the no permit or no cost permit to have to adopt an ash tree to treat it, we'll actually have the staff go out and look at it, and we want to make sure that it's a tree that's in good health, that it's being properly managed, that it isn't, as Eric said, under a property line. We want to make sure that it's a tree that is viable over the long term. And then we'll make a determination that yes, that tree is suitable for adoption. And then The method that we will be writing this into the plan, an omission of the plan as it's written today, is the only method that we will be allowing for public trees is the trunk injection method by a licensed professional.
And the program for neighborhoods that have street ash trees, there's some, I mean, there's only so many you can do a year. Are you filled up for 2018?
We actually are at this point, yeah. This has been a very proactive approach. The community is responding, I think, very favorably to this. And I think one of the reasons they are is the one-for-one replacement. We know that taking down ash trees in neighborhoods has a fairly significant impact on the character and identity of those neighborhoods. But neighborhoods have been very responsive, and we continue to get contacted by neighborhood representatives. We have filled the quota in terms of the number of trees that we're going to be removing for 2018. We're actually beginning to fill the quota already for 2019, and we're looking towards 2020. So if people are interested in beginning to work with us on the process of planning for removal and replanting of the trees, we encourage them to get in contact with Lori Gruber.
How many trees can you remove a year?
Right now, it's really, the plan is that we'll be removing about 1,000 ash trees a year. And the reason for limiting that factor is that as the trees are removed, we want to be replanting. And the process of working with the private sector to replant the trees and get them established, we think that about 1,000 trees a year is the maximum number of trees that we'll be managing. I think there's an important kind of side aspect to Emerald Ash Borer. The city crews that will be removing trees, we estimate that it'll take about 100 days for that crew to remove those 1,000 trees. After that, there's about 150 days of work days remaining in the year. That crew will then shift to tree trimming, to pruning the other trees in the community forest, and that'll help us catch up on some of the backlog that we have right now on trimming the existing trees along streets and in parks.
Can you explain a little bit why the Emerald Ash Borer destroys trees?
Yeah, there's two elements of or two phases of the insect. The adult form feeds on the leaves, and then it lays eggs on the bark, and it's actually the larval form that actually does the damage. The larval form actually feeds right underneath the bark, and it has a zigzag feeding pattern. And what's happening as it feeds under the bark is it's cutting off the water and nutrient conducting tissue of the tree. And so gradually the tree loses its ability to move water and nutrients up and down the trunk, and they dry out and they die is what happens.
What advice would you have for people who have ash trees on their private property?
Yeah, we encourage private property owners to go through essentially the same process that the city has, is to identify which trees, if any, on their property are ash trees, look at the condition and the value of those trees. If they're not in a location that perhaps provides either significant shade value for their homes or their outdoor activity areas, or it's not a tree that's really critical to kind of the aesthetics of their landscape, they may want to consider taking that tree down and then replacing it. If it is a tree that is particularly important to them, they probably want to think about getting that on a regular treatment cycle. And as I said, it's probably too soon to begin treatment right now. But we anticipate, or we won't be surprised if Emerald Ash Borer is identified in Lincoln in the near future. But it really is kind of that advanced planning, thinking about the importance of that tree in the landscape, and then what the long-term plan is.
What are some of the first signs of damage that you can see on?
The insect actually begins feeding in the upper portion of the canopy, and so there'll be some yellowing and there'll be some dying twigs that will happen in the upper portion of the canopy, and then as more insects infest that tree, it gradually moves down. You'll start to see dead branches in the upper portion of the canopy. The tree then will try to respond to that, and it will send out a lot of sucker growth or a lot of sprouts, and gradually the trees they die essentially from the top down. One of the things that's unique about Emerald Ash Borer compared to our native borers is that the exit hole coming out through the bark as the larva mutate or transition into the adult form of the insect, when they emerge through the bark, they actually create a D-shaped exit hole Our native ash borers create a circular exit hole. So it's one of the identifying characteristics of emerald ash borer. But the things really to watch for are that yellowing and the gradual sort of dieback of the canopy from the top, and then that sucker growth that happens, and then kind of the gradual decline and drying out of the tree over time. We've been monitoring trees that native ash borers will have a similar impact on trees, and so we've actually seen a number of ash trees that have died as a result of impact from native borers. But we've not identified emerald ash borer yet in Lincoln.
Do you have when do you think they will be here? Is there any way you know?
There really isn't any way to know at this point. The challenge with emerald ash borer is that the adult form of the beetles is feeding clear up in the top of the canopies of the trees, so it's a place that you can't really see it. And so it doesn't really become highly visible until the trees are starting to be fairly significantly impacted. It seems to move along major transportation corridors. The bugs seem to sort of hitchhike on trucks and cars. That seems to be one of the ways that it's been moving. Obviously, Lincoln is on the I-80 corridor. It's on major transportation corridors, so it does seem very likely that we probably have some insects in the community that may have hitchhiked their way into Lincoln at this point, but at this point it's not been identified.
Did you say how far outside of Lincoln they have been identified?
It's in Greenwood at this point, which is just about 15 or 16 miles beyond the northeast boundary of Lincoln.
How do you check for them? Do you have a routine places to check?
There's and I should let Eric talk about this, but there's actually, the Nebraska Forest Service actually has a method of trapping them. There's a pheromone system to try to attract the insects. It hasn't been terribly successful. The thing that we do is that when we see a tree that looks like it might have emerald ash borer, one of the things that you do is you actually peel the bark. And so you're looking for that D-shaped exit hole, and you're looking for that very characteristic sort of feeding pattern that happens underneath the bark. So we do have staff, as we're removing ash trees that have symptoms, we are peeling back bark, and we're looking to see if it looks like it's emerald ash borer. Lori gets calls from time to time. We actually had a gentleman last summer. There's a lot of kind of look-alike insects. There's a lot of insects that look like emerald ash borer. And we had a gentleman last summer that showed up with, it was an empty soda bottle that had a bright, shiny green beetle in it, and he was certain he had emerald ash borer. Turned out to be one of the look-alikes, but if somebody thinks that they've got emerald ash borer, they should contact either the Forest Service or us or Cooperative Extension.
Could you comment on the woodpecker activity that's involved with the emerald ash borer?
That you're right. That is another symptom that if you see a lot of woodpecker activity in the trees, the woodpeckers are interested in feeding on the larvae, and so that can be another sign or symptom that your tree may have emerald ash borer, is that the woodpeckers are feeding on the tree and trying to find that larva underneath the bark.
Why pick on the little guys? Why are you taking the small trees?
Great question. We're trying to preserve the largest canopy for the greatest length of time. So we're trying to sort of minimize the impact of this as long as we can. So those big trees provide a lot of benefit in the community. We're trying to leave them in place as long as possible. There's also less impact. The replacement, when you take down a smaller tree and you plant a young tree, the difference of the values is much less. That will also give us 10, 12, 15 years of growth on the younger trees as we're removing the large trees. So.
Did you say in your first name?
Yeah, it's Lynn Johnson, LYNNJOHNSON, and I'm the Parks and Recreation Director in Lincoln.
Could I actually get your first name as well?
Sure. It's Eric Berg, ERIC, BERG, with the Nebraska Forest Service.
Thank you.
Okay, are you all good to go? Thank you for
Thanks very much.
spreading the word about the problem. Appreciate it. Then thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.